one. Hello everyone, this is Mauro Fiuza and we are here for the 4th VoiceLab Live. And today we have, of course, Filipa Lã and our special guest, Professor Sten Ternström, Professor of Music Acoustics in Stockholm, Sweden, in the Royal University of Stockholm. And we will talk a lot about voice science, music acoustics, and why not some choir singing, since he's also a choir singer. And so I'd like to welcome you, Sten Ternström.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming to our live session. We are delightful to have you here and apologize for the change of dates to those who were counting on having you here earlier on in our sessions. But we managed to get you here. So could we start to ask you, how did you start to be involved with the research about voice? Well, I know you are a singer and a songwriter. So I was wondering whether these activities influence your decision.
If we go back a long way, I like to build things. I remember getting my first Meccano set as a birthday present when I was 7. And then I got bigger sets every year and for quite a few years. And I loved building things, making things work. And later I sort of moved into these electronic kits. I don't know if you've seen them, but you could build little intercoms and radios and things on a sort of a breadboard thing, and that was fun. And I also like music. So in high school I started singing in the choir, mostly because the people who were doing it seemed very nice. And that sort of grew on me. And I got a very nice start to my singing activities when I was, well, around 15, 16, 17 years old. And then at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, I started studying at 19 or so and doing electrical engineering. But I soon found that in a small basement up under the pile of bricks at KTH, there was a tall man called Johan Sundberg who was doing work on the voice. And so I got in touch with him, and that had a great consequence for the rest of my career because I became his student for my Ph.D. Eventually, although that was like 8 years later or something. First I was a research engineer. And he noticed that I was interested in choir singing, so he got some grants and got me started on that. And then I made myself sort of useful around what was then called the Speech Transmission Laboratory, which was started by Gunnar Fant. That's when I started analysing voice really more seriously. There was the grand old dame of Swedish logopedics, Britta Hammarberg, and an engineer called Jan Goffeng. They were very early doing voice analysis on microcomputers, which in the early 1980s were very new. And there was a lot of optimism, and people thought that, okay, with the computers we will soon crack this thing with voice analysis, and I was doing fundamental frequency measurements in particular. And these people helped me a lot to get started. I also spent several episodes over in San Francisco in the lab of Tom Shipp, who was a specialist in EMG, electromyography. He would stick wires into people's laryngeal muscles to see what the muscles were doing.
But was that during your PhD or afterwards?
No, that was before.
Before?
Actually, yeah. So I was in the first time in San Francisco was from 83 to 84 or so. And then I returned there, I think, twice. And that was all before my PhD in 89. So I kind of gravitated from music acoustics to voice research.
And your PhD was about choir singing, wasn't
Yes, this was all about choir acoustics, and it was like the nice thing, of course, was that not many people had done any research on choir acoustics before that, but Johan sort of figured out that this is probably something that people want to know more about, and that was right, of course. And so I had the luxury as a researcher of having a big user group or end user people wanting to know more about it.
So tell me something, because I think it's already very complicated to study one single voice. What about studying the voice of many people singing together? That should be very difficult. How do you do it?
Well, it's all just copies of the same thing. No, but other things happen when you have many voices sounding together. I mean, the sound of a choir is different from the sound of one voice. And so much of the work then was about figuring out what was that difference and what parts of the choral sound are important and what sounds are not so important and so on. I mean, you might say that choir singing is a very forgiving art form. It's a sort of a statistical art form because what the audience hears is usually an average of, and for most choirs, it's probably just as well that we don't hear what the individual singers are doing. Then so you'll have an average pitch and perhaps a standard deviation in pitch, which hopefully will be small. So I was measuring those things and had a lot of fun doing that. And that's, of course, a connection, if you will, between science and art. You know, the motto of KTH is actually Vetenskap och konst. And I've been thinking about that for a bit. You know, what is it that is being interested, like you said earlier, in singing and songwriting and so on. I was also thinking, is there some way of connecting these science to art? Some people say that that's just an artificial division, that they are just two aspects of the same thing. I'm not so sure, because I think the premises of science is that you want to be in some sense objective and you want to be factual and find out some sort of truth in some sense, whereas in art the thing is not to be objective, it's to be subjective, it's to find expression for things.
Unless you want to optimize your art, and then you need to look more into detail to it, and then to be able to improve it. I mean, nobody will improve their artistry if they are completely subjective all their lives, I think.
No, exactly. So the thing that unites them, I think, is really the craft, you know, and like how you do things with things. You have to know how to paint, you have to know how to throw the light, or you have to know how to, there's lots of skills that you need in order to become a good artist, just as there are the same very similar skills actually needed to become a good scientist. And so in fact craft is really an old word for technology, so whereas science and art today comes across as that, when the motto of KTH was formulated, it really meant science and craft, because the engineers that were being trained there, they were supposed to know the technique, the technology. And I kind of feel very much at home in that sort of ambience, I think.
Wonderful. So, and talking about that combination of science and art, you came up in your career to develop software that allow us to look at the art from a more scientific perspective. So you developed software such as the free now one, Phonodine, but also the other very important softwares that gave birth to many papers in voice science, that was Soundswell. So what fascinated you most about the voice that compelled you to make a more objective and scientific eye to it?
Well, we're all fascinated by the voice, and being sort of analytical of disposition, I think that it would be, always thought it would be interesting to measure it. And since there were these projects with Britta Hammarberg and Gofeng initially, and others also, which were about measuring fundamental frequency and perturbations and so on, because that was the stuff that was low-hanging fruit, if you will. It was like the things that were easy to measure. And then the technical evolution was very fast, and I was intrigued with the new operating systems. I mean, Windows came in '85, and I think Swell was actually the first sound editor for Windows ever. And the WAV files didn't exist, so we had to invent a new file format until WAV files came along, and so on. But the interesting thing was that the clinicians, I was very suspicious of lots of measurements that were done without actually looking at the signal. So it's really important in my way of looking at things is, if you record a voice, you have to look at the signal before you attempt to measure anything from it, or because there might be a number of things wrong with the signal. And this idea kind of took hold, and clinicians liked it once they got used to it, you know. So we spent a number of years. Here's the original. Let's see if I can.
Now we can see it.
Yeah, it's in the mid-'80s, I started a little company on my own, and then about 10 years later, we spun off a more serious company. And those things are still being used, believe it or not. But I'd rather not they were, because we have learned much more since then. Anyway, so another thing we did, I had a colleague called Lennart Njorvius, who was interested in speech synthesis, and I was interested in singing machines. And so we discovered that we would try to do pretty much the same things. At the time, you know, the thing to do was source filter synthesis with a source and a filter, which is, of course, the you know, the whole idea of formants and source functions, and the framework for that is very similar for speech and singing. So and at the same time, computers at that time were too slow. They couldn't do anything useful with sound in real time. But so you had to buy special chips called digital signal processors, and they were very difficult to program. So we figured out a way of using them without the user having to program them, sort of a graphical programming for DSPs, and we had lots of fun with that. And we tried to sell it, and it was called Aladdin.
Aladdin.
Yeah. And it was a sort of a Lego for sound, if you like.
Is it still available?
No, because the hardware that it ran on is completely obsolete now. And it's the other reason, of course, is that the personal computer now is so fast that you don't need a special signal processor. Most of the stuff you can do in the PC itself. But anyway, I learnt a lot, and I taught a lot with it, and we didn't actually manage to sell very many copies of Aladdin, but we did manage to make several products written with Aladdin. So we did, let's see, what were the main things? Well, one interesting thing was a hearing loss simulator that one of our colleagues built, which was a sort of a machine that would process sound so that it sounded like somebody with a hearing problem might hear it. Mm. And why would you want to do that? Well, to show the family and colleagues of that person what the sound is like. And that had a huge impact. I mean, almost all the audiology clinics in Sweden bought one, and people were crying when they heard it. You know, I didn't realize it was that bad, and we will really make an effort to not turn up the television too much, or you know, and always to look at the person speaking, and so or listening, I should say, and so on. So that was fun. And another thing was a tinnitus simulator that we did with that, so the patient can sort of demonstrate to the clinician what the tinnitus sounds like, and a number of industrial things as well. So we had lots of fun with that.
Wow.
And then in the 90s, I met Peter Pabon, who is, of course, the pioneer of the computerized voice range profile. And he was a nerd for signal processing too, so we sort of found a common grain of understanding and had lots of fun with that.
Great minds think alike.
Well, the problem with Peter is that he thinks so much that he hasn't got time to tell people about it. So I feel I've had the great privilege actually of coaching him through his Ph.D. and getting stuff out of his drawers and onto the paper, which was a great experience, and we continue to be in close touch, and we both continue to be very committed to developing voice analysis into something useful. And the annoying thing, of course, is that like 30, 40 years down the road, we're still not there. We thought this was going to be easy, but it's still but now I have a sort of concept of what should be done, but it took a while. And now I just hope I'll have time to get it into the streets before it's too late. Anyway, so we even back in the early 2000s, I was approached by a singer, Annick Lamarche, who had voice problems herself, and she had found that when singers come to voice clinics, their voice problems are perceived as being too subtle, to be even understood by the pathologist. And so she wanted to figure out a way of addressing the particular problems of singers in the clinic. And
she's now a speech and language therapist.
She is, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, in Canada.
In Canada, yes.
And so her PhD thesis was also all about the voice range profile, and using it in new ways to try to track down subtle problems of singers. And we also made that's another thing we did with Aladdin. Actually, we built a voice range profiler program called FOG, which was sort of compatible with the other programs we had written. I did some of the groundwork there, and then Svante added a lot of things. The Svante that you met in an earlier installment here.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so then time wore on, and around 2010, I think, Peter said that, well, there are these things in the voice range profile that I don't understand, and I'd like to find out what is causing these features. So we started a project on combining the microphone signal with the electroglottography signal.
Yes, I think Mauro wants to ask you something about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're talking about the Phonadine, right?
Phonadine,
for those who don't know, it's a software where we can create some voice maps, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just love it. We are using it here in the VoiceLab, as you know, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I like because we can compare these voice maps over time after training, print pause, a huge amount of possibilities for the use of the Phonadine. And as Filipa said, it's free, which is nice. So could you tell us a bit more about the software and why should we use the Phonadine?
Well, see, what happened was, back in the early days, people were looking at things like fundamental frequency and frequency perturbations and how loud the voice is and a number of other things. There are hundreds of metrics in the literature, and the really frustrating thing is that if you take any one of these metrics on its own, it doesn't really seem to cut it. There's no metric that can tell you on its own if a voice is normal or ill, because the voice is too complicated.
Adrian Fersen, I think, sets up a percentage of EGG, jitter, and shimmer, from above which it's more likely to be a pathological voice. That is 6% of shimmer and jitter in the EGG signal. So you would disagree that would be a measure
Well,
to?
I think it's a bit. I think with hindsight, I think it's a bit simplistic because we know that jitter and shimmer are extremely dependent on how loud the voice is. So and in most studies, people don't control for that. There's been a string of studies now by Maike Brockmann in Zurich and her colleagues and even Peter's paper from 1988 shows that the jitter is extremely dependent on the sound pressure level. So if you just look at that in isolation, you would need a lot of subjects and averaging them and also controlling for how loud their voices are before you could get sort of any clinical evidence.
But I mean, the EGG is not picking up the microphone signal. So I was referring just to the EGG signal itself, the amplitude and the frequency perturbation of the waveform of contacting and decontacting vocal folds. Do you think that applies? Is the same?
Yeah, it applies in the same way there. It's a somewhat simpler signal in that it's not sort of confounded with formants and with turbulence and stuff. So it has a lot of interesting properties because of that. But you can take almost any metric, and Peter showed this very nicely, I think, with his voice maps. I mean, the history is that those things were called phonetograms first, but then when you make a phonetogram, you're really only concerned with finding the maximum loudness and the minimum, minimum sound level of a voice, and you don't really care about what goes on in between. But what Peter did more than anyone else is that he used colors to map what goes on in between, and that's where I think, or I sort of believe he is onto something very important there, and that's what Phonodin does. So it measures a whole lot of metrics in parallel, and then you can switch and color the maps according to the metric that you choose. And the other thing that Peter saw was that he saw that people are extremely different. If you make a map of several people, the interior of the phonetogram can look very different from one person to another. I mean, means
and even the border, isn't it? I mean, the range.
Oh yeah, absolutely, right. But what he also saw was that if you ask the same person to do the phonetogram several times, you get pretty much a similar picture. So people are different, but they are also consistent with themselves, and that's what makes it what opens up the possibility for actually using it to track the progress of a training or of a treatment. And so much of the work with Phonodin is about facilitating that, so that we can make a map before and after, like Mauro was saying, and then have the system show us what changed in the meantime. And you can do that if you compare within the person, but people in the medical field are so accustomed to the idea that we should find cut-off values for pathology. If the jitter is greater than X%, then we will consider it. But that's a meaningless statement, because the percentage jitter changes all the time, and also because the jitter depends on like 4 or 5 different things which have different causes.
From 2 questions. Why looking at the EGG signal to do Phonodin and not do a phonetogram? That's my first question. Why would you center? I mean, you also use acoustic input into Phonodin because loudness is something that you control very much when you use the software. But perhaps you could tell us more. What did you see in the EGG that made you build up the voice map also based on EGG metrics?
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, so what Peter said he saw was that when you look at the voice map, it has a sort of a oblong shape. Everything gets louder as pitch goes up. But he also saw that in the middle of the island that you get, things seem to change a lot along, sort of roughly along the midline inside the phonetogram. and he couldn't figure out what is the cause of that. Why do a lot of metrics suddenly change as you go from, say, 70 to 75 decibels, or depending on what the pitch is and all of that. And so we thought that, well, it might have to do with the way the vocal folds are contacting each other. And indeed, when we hooked up the EGG, like Andreas did for his PhD thesis, we started looking at that. And it turns out that it's actually that midline is pretty much the same as the point where the vocal folds start to collide. And I thought that was a very interesting revelation, because it means that we, in soft voice, we very often have a partial sort of vibration, or the vocal folds are not even colliding properly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only when we come, if you want to know where that collision is, you can actually ask people to talk, and you will find that people will not make a bigger effort than they absolutely must. So when we look at the speech range, it's always just above the point of collision of the EGG. And that's a very interesting insight, but it also means that if you ask someone in the clinic to sustain a vowel, it makes a huge difference if you happen to be just below that limit or just above that limit, and people are not checking for that. So, and this is why this is one reason why we get so much standard deviation, and why it's so difficult to get clinically valid metrics, because the voice has a lot of shifts and changes over the voice range. So the point of the voice mapping is, let's try to collect as many signals as we can and map them over FO and SPL, and then make some sort of intelligent collation of these different signals, and then we can backtrack to what we think the vocal folds are doing. I think the EGG, Peter never did anything with the EGG, but he's definitely doing it now. Now that he's seen how it complements the acoustic signal, I think it would be great if we could also plug in an inverse filter so that we get the flow, and maybe even a photoglottograph so that we get the glottal area and so on. And technically, this is all possible to do, but it becomes like a house of cards that can crash if you put in too much. So what I'm trying to do now with Huan Shen, who is my PhD student, is we're trying to find the smallest possible set of metrics that will still give a reasonably complete picture of what the voice is doing. And that's quite interesting.
One thing that came to my mind when you were talking about the measurements, should we avoid at all costs the comfortable pitch and loudness?
No, but you have to know, if you ask for people to phonate at a comfortable pitch and loudness, you have to have some way of knowing that what they're doing at that moment is representative of the thing that you want to measure. For example, there have been several studies where people have done soft, comfortable, loud before and soft, comfortable, loud after, and the effect of treatment hasn't come out very clearly. The problem is that when you do that, they haven't tried to match the soft, comfortable, loud pre and post. And so it turns out that we've just done a big study here with the team in Zurich, and I don't want to preempt the publication, or sort of, it's going to be published. But basically what it shows is that if you don't control for SPL and FO, then the effects of SPL and FO are much bigger than the effect of the treatment, and so you don't see the effect of the treatment.
Yeah. Isn't it also because, I mean, I tend to compare, for example, singers to athletes, and I mean, if you just use a movement with your body that doesn't allow the extremes, maybe you are still able to perform under non-optimal conditions. But from a singer's point of view, that's not comfortable at all, because you will have to reach some parts that are extremes of your voice. So I wonder, and a good question, Mauro, that if we want to see the effects of, for example, voice education, to ask a singer sing in a comfortable pitch and loudness is something that they will do whatever they have, even if they are, with one leg short, they will do it. If they were athletes. So I think this question is rather important to discuss, because I think it's in the extremes and the difficulty when you put the system into stress that you really see how the system behaves. So it's.
Or you could put it another way. It's like, if you have a healthy system, then it should be able to go to certain extremes. But if you're completely unable to produce a sound louder than 90 dB, then something is probably wrong with your voice. So sure, but and of course singers should sing comfortably, but that's a different thing. I mean, the problem with the conventional way of sampling somebody's voice is that if you ask somebody to say in a comfortable pitch and loudness, if they were to say or you get completely different results. And there are only a few decibels difference between them, you see, and people aren't quite aware of this, it seems. So they just accept a production which is a bit random, and then when you compare it after treatment, they might be more comfortable, which is good, or they might actually do it louder or softer or something. Or if they have a voice problem, they might actually avoid the problem when they're phonating, because it's not comfortable to do that. So I think we have to, if we consider this from the voice map perspective, and you ask somebody to just produce a sustained vowel, that's like one dot on the map. Or put more extremely, it's like one pixel of a photo. And you would not dream of characterizing somebody's face from just a few pixels out of a photo. You need the whole picture. Is how I see this. Now, but of course, clinicians don't like the voice range profile, because it takes quite a few minutes to collect, and they're too much in a hurry. And so another thing we need to learn to do is how to get that information in as short a time as possible.
Please tell me when you find out.
Yeah, right. But we have to.
We will, because we will do so many voice range profiles that at the end we will be able to provide you with some.
I hope so.
Well, one way of doing it would be not to do it in the clinic, but to have the patient do it at home first, and then bring that to the clinic. Because then we don't have to take the time in the clinic. But to do that, we need some very robust protocol and some very clever stuff. But I think that we can tell on the phone what somebody's voice is like, and so in principle, a machine should be able to tell as well. But we have some work to do there.
Certainly. I also like to think in these voice maps, not an entire voice range profile going to all extremes and so on.
Right.
But for example, to creating specific voice maps, like a chest voice map, falsetto voice map, flow phonation voice map, for example. So we could check how voice behave when in these different kinds of voice production. Especially for non-classical voices, which we could create, for example, a breathy voice phonation. So we could see how much a singer could sing in a breathy voice, for example. And how do you see such use of technology in singing classes, voice training?
Right, I think I'm not a singing teacher myself, and I'm only an amateur singer. But I would think that the possibilities for visual feedback there should be very, very great. I mean, the voice is not one instrument. If I change to falsetto, I'm using a different instrument. And so you need to make separate maps of those. Again, like Peter did in his work, he kept, in some of the studies, he was very careful to make maps of the head voice and the chest voice separate in the same person.
I would disagree with you that if you use falsetto, you are using a different voice instrument.
Not from a music acoustics point of view, because the vibrating system is behaving in a different way.
Yeah, but from a teacher of singing point of view, the ultimate goal will be to sound falsetto as you and not perceptually be understood as a different instrument, right? Because it is your voice, and in some styles of music you are required to sing falsetto and modal voice at the same time. For example, yodel. I mean, yodel visits falsetto very much, but it's part of the style. So, but I understood what you said. It was just to make the terminology to teachers of singing a bit more and understood, because it's not a different instrument; it's still your voice, and you need to.
Well, it's well, all right. So, but if you play the clarinet, then it's one thing to play in the low register, and as soon as you press the register key, the instrument behaves differently. So
acoustically.
Yeah, but also even in the way you play it, you need to control it in a different way when you're in one register and when you're in the other.
But it's the same clarinet.
Well, that's a matter of definition, really. I mean,
well, no, I think yes, it's a question of definition. But voice is voice, whatever you do.
But if you have it, all right. Well, so if you have a guitar, if you play it in the normal way, that it sounds in one way. If you play it with a flageolet, then you're using the string in a different way. And we can argue about whether that makes it a different instrument or not. I mean, obviously, physically, it's the same object, but it's generating sound in a different way. And when we use the head voice or the chest voice, we're generating sound in slightly different ways, because we're setting up the vocal folds to vibrate a lot or in a sort of thinner way. And of course, in other singing styles like the ones that Mauro knows about, they're used in other ways still.
Rock distortion.
Yeah, right.
Not only
he's very upset when we say rock and distortion, because he says he's not all about that. There's many other things going on.
But there are genres where things are supposed to. I went to an amazing conference paper once at the ASA meeting, where there was a paper about a very special type of Korean monk singing, and it's supposed to express sort of the pain of the universe or something, and they actually have to train shouting by a waterfall for 3 years until their vocal folds are bleeding, and they sound absolutely horrible, but that's the way it's supposed to be, apparently. So there are all sorts of ideals out there. I think we can, for most of us, we're concerned with finding an efficient way of singing, so that we make a lot of sound with a little effort and with little risk to the vocal folds.
That's why it's important an objective look at the voice, and not just perceptive or perceptual and subjective, although there is perceptual also objective. But anyway, because we were early on before the live discussing this thing about perceptual, subjective evaluation and objective evaluation. Yes.
Well, this is of course very frustrating to the engineer, that it's much easier to hear what's going on with the voice than to measure what's going on with the voice. But that's because the voice is such an intimate part of our bodies, and the whole way we interpret voices is sort of embodied in our cells. When we hear a sound, we kind of automatically think, okay, how would I have made that sound? And this is why our throats sort of start cramping when we hear somebody who has a very hoarse voice, for example. But a machine doesn't have this embodiment. The machine has no idea of what it's like to have a voice. So we have to sort of do everything by numbers, and is a long haul, because the brain has evolved a lot. But now things are happening very quickly, and what's worrying me is that there is this extremely strong trend of machine learning in all domains of analysis, which essentially is just about throwing sounds at the computer and saying this is sick and this is healthy, and then letting the computer infer from new sounds if they are sick or healthy. And of course there's absolutely no knowledge embodied in that. It's just pattern matching, and that worries me a bit, because I think we should not
I actually can agree.
Abdicate from the knowledge, you know.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with you, because the other day I tried an app for the iPhone that says whether you have a pathological voice or not.
Oh dear.
And the person really has a pathological voice, and the examination of that app is to sustain a vowel of the app for and then say a phrase, something like that, and then it comes a report at the end saying, "Congratulations, your voice is blah blah blah." You know, and the person was completely surprised with the result, because the result was that you have not a pathological voice. Your voice is completely normal and healthy. And he has been to the ENT who died.
I mean, you should be very, very, very wary of that sort of stuff, because it's much more difficult than that. And you have lots of sham products out there. There are also products like, for example, lie detectors that claim to be able to say whether you're telling the truth or not. And the terrible thing is that people are making money out of this, and there are even official authorities using this to decide whether people are being truthful when they apply for social support and this sort of thing. And it's terrible. And many of those products are simply just sham. I mean, it's
But by the way that we are talking about this, just when a question came to my mind, would you trust a recording done by a mobile to analyze and do research with it?
Not yet, but things are moving quickly, and it all depends. I mean, the technology is moving very quickly with these mobile phones, and the lifetime of a model is less than a year, I mean, usually. And which is completely different from what you want in a clinical setting, where you want to get something approved for clinical analysis. It could take 3 or 4 years to get a product approved, and by then a mobile phone is completely out of date. So it's very difficult to do it by the book. It might yet be possible if we do something clever. Not lots of clever people thinking about it. Microphones and the phone connection, I mean the transmission is getting a lot better year by year. So I think it's very likely that we will be able to do some kinds of analysis over the phone, not too distant future. But for making voice maps, the problem is that you need a sort of a coaching to do it properly. But again, we could have a software wizard in the phone saying, or make it gamify it, make it into a game. Move your voice around like this and make as big a blob as you can.
That will be fantastic to make, because we will put many people singing, and they will be much happier with their lives. Because
yes, exactly. Yeah. I think there's lots of exciting things to come, and or maybe somebody will invent a sort of standard microphone that you can clip onto your mobile so that you know what it is. But it is a problem, because people who build mobiles are not interested in these, verifiable signal chains. They just throw in anything that makes it sound better. And people are extremely clever with that. But often you can't really trust what comes out of the mobile. But who knows? I think the main problem when it comes to this development stuff is that voice problems don't kill you. And why is that a problem? Well, because it means that the people who are doing this development, it's difficult to get the money to fund it properly, because there are other more important things to do development of, like cancer treatments or whatever. So much of the work that's being done is typically done like student projects at universities, and then that might be very clever, but still when the student moves on, the work is sort of forgotten or lost. And the reason this doesn't actually catch on is that we still haven't been able to show that the numbers we get are of real clinical value. And until we do that, we're not going to get the money to build better instruments, I think. We still have the burden of proof is on the engineers and the clinicians to say that, okay, if we have a machine like this, it really tells us that this person has gotten better thanks to this treatment. And I think we will get there, but it's been much harder than we thought at the beginning.
I think their education has a huge role for it, because if you educate people to expect to hear healthy voices and the importance of having a healthy voice in many fields, that would maybe help. I don't know. What do you think, Mauro?
Yeah, certainly. But also, I like to dig more into this technology thing. How teachers of singing and speech pathologists may benefit from going into this technology world and understanding of the metrics and measurements and so on.
Well, yeah. So when I was younger, I thought, oh yes, this is not going to be hard at all. I mean, obviously, if you measure something, and you will understand something more about it. But the more I see of this, the more I realize that the technology that you need to do something sensible is a bit. It's not something that's easily explained to someone who doesn't have a technical background. And it shouldn't be either. I mean, you don't need to know how an internal combustion engine works in order to drive a car. You just need to know how to drive it, and essentially most of the technology can remain invisible. And we're not quite there yet, because the people who do research and the engineers who measure voices, they're very anxious to explain everything, because that's in the sort of scientific tradition. But in the process of doing so, you tend to sort of, my impression is that very few teachers of singing have the patience to listen to all these explanations, and they can't really judge which of these metrics is better or not. And so I think we still haven't quite closed the application gap. I think engineers need to understand more of what it is exactly that pedagogues and clinicians want, and then they have to build a system which is like a car, that you don't have to know what goes on underneath, but that the output is very clear at saying that. So for instance, I imagine that it would be useful to have a voice map that shows when you're in head voice or in modal voice, or when your vocal folds are contacting or not, and so on, or when your voice is excessively breathy or unstable or something like that. And we're on our way. That's going to happen. I think that's going to happen within the next year or two, actually, that we will have real-time mapping that does that. But you can only do it if you measure lots of things at the same time, and then look at the combinations that you see. So, I mean, you could have a high value of breathiness or jitter, and that's perfectly okay in soft voice, but it's not so okay in loud voice. So you have to look at the combination of several things before you can say whether it's good or bad,
And of course, a computer will not tell you how to sing. So you want
No. That's quite,
so singers of teachers
And there's
singing, they should not be afraid of losing their jobs because the computer will not replace a human hearing system, I think. And
well,
also
no, but
At least
emotional.
not by now. No?
No.
No, exactly, not by now. But when we, in 20 years' time, or 30, when there are androids that actually start to have something that reminds us of the human body, then we can start. Yes, but I think that's why should we do that? I mean,
Yes.
there are more than enough people on the planet as it is. We should.
Yeah.
Why add anything?
No.
Yeah.
So let's change the topic a little bit because we're getting into much of scientific.
We already have
Dystopia.
some singers sounding like androids.
Yeah, well, but maybe better sounding like androids than my cat screaming. I don't know. Anyway, as the director of a voice lab for many years that you are now, because you are the head of the music and acoustics group in KTH, what is the most challenging aspect of running a lab?
The thing is, I think you really need to want to be a director, and that's where I fall short. I think I'm not so interested in all the important stuff that you need to do in addition to the science. You have to make sure that people get their money, and you have to make sure that people meet the right people, and you have to write in the right places, and you have to do a lot of stuff sort of to create the environment. And I must admit that I haven't really had enough patience for doing that, because I've always been so engrossed in trying to answer the scientific question, and so I'm not sure that my leadership has been exemplary in that effect, in that respect. And in fact, at the moment, I'm not formally the leader of anything really. It's just that I'm the guy in the department who's been doing most of the voice research for a long time, and I'm very happy not being formally the leader, because I think the in an academic environment today, the demands on such people are extremely high. I mean, you really have to be a very high-performing person in all sorts of things to make a successful, what is perceived as a successful academic career.
So are voice labs now forced to be just at the clinics, voice clinics, you think? And we are running short of voice labs around, for example, Europe. I'm not talking about the American reality, that I don't know. But how do you see that the voice labs are nowadays in Europe? Because I remember when I was a PhD student more than 15 years now ago, KTH was a European reference for going to meet people, because there was a voice lab there with many researchers working on the same, field. So you could gain lots of experience from being there. And if we think now about Europe, I don't see many places where I would go to get knowledge from, being in this setting of what would it's my concept of a voice lab from the beginning of the century. So what is your perspective? What do you think? Are more voice labs growing in numbers? Is it or disappearing, or how do you see it?
Yeah, okay. Right. So there's something that has been happening over the past 2 or 3 decades, and that is, at least where I am at KTH, where I work in a department of speech, music and hearing, and most of the people at our department are working in speech technology. And that means machines that talk and machines that listen. And it used to be, in the days of Gunnar Fant and his successors, that was knowledge-based, that it was like, we have the source filter model, or we have some other model, and we have these models, and we understand how they work, and we understand how they produce the sound. And then in the 90s, the computers came along and people said, oh, that's too difficult. Let's just record speech and chop it up into little bits and put them back together again, like concatenating speech synthesis. And that was harder to do than we thought, but at least it sounded more natural than the source filter synthesizers. And then as computers became more and more powerful, with these techniques that now are called machine learning techniques that have emerged. The problem with these machine learning techniques is that they are kind of well, they're modeled on the way our brain works, but the problem is we don't know how our brain works yet. So it's really a huge assembly of neurons that somehow have the ability to recognize patterns. And with the advent of these big companies like Apple and Google and whatnot, they have the resources to build absolutely huge machines that can make that, and they also have the access to people's conversations and speech by the millions, and so that they can develop these enormous neural networks that actually do excellent speech recognition and do excellent speech synthesis, but nobody knows how they work, more or less. And it's a bit like if suppose you took a loudspeaker and you have a pair of wires going to the loudspeaker, and then you hook up those two wires to a couple of neurons in your brain, and then you tell the person to learn to speak just by saying practice. It's like trying to, and the amazing thing is that these networks actually do. They manage to drive the loudspeaker from just looking at millions and millions of examples. But this also means that we have very little control over how that happens, and people are getting better and better at machine learning, and the techniques are advancing very, very quickly. And in fact, they are advancing so quickly that the machines will probably be able to teach themselves. It's just a matter of time now until we have a machine that can learn to speak in the way that a baby learns to speak. But only the very biggest companies can do that, which makes the process rather not transparent. They have their secret labs and they have their reasons for doing it. And that bothers me a bit. And I think in the meantime, so the perception of the public is that speech is a solved problem, but actually it isn't. And that's maybe why we're not getting so many. I'm not sure I agree with you that there are fewer voice labs now around, but there are certainly fewer places where people study the mechanisms of voice production.
I can remember. I can come to my mind Jan Švec in
he's one.
Czech Republic. Michael Döllinger in Germany, and then there is also, of course, Germany is quite active with Berlin and Dresden and Freiburg and Hamburg. Yes. But what I meant was that labs that study the basics of voice production instead of machine learning and models of the voice, and so that labs that bring people to them, record those people and study their voices. That's what I meant.
No, that's true, because the incentive to study the basics of voice production have become weaker because there are other machines that are able to talk anyway, by completely different mechanisms. And I think we need to hold our ground here and say that, no, we need to study the voice, because otherwise we don't need... And there's a huge cost with the Google way of doing it. They need computer farms that consume megawatt hours of electricity to train. I mean, just to train a network in a new way can cost millions of dollars in electricity. And people don't talk about that very much. If we had systems that were model based, you could make them much smaller and get them to talk equally well because some of the knowledge would be sort of built into it. And there are people doing that, and we can almost see trends now that the pendulum is swinging a little bit back toward the knowledge grounding, but it's not very clear yet. So it's very interesting. Definitely, but I also think we can use machine learning in sensible ways to sort of deal with the variability of the voice, which is a bit overwhelming at times. So that's what interests me also with the voice maps, that they're so rich with information, but we need some way of pulling out the really useful bits of information. And I think machine learning has something to contribute there. Problem is I haven't had time to learn it myself very well yet. And like you, I have this instinctive resistance against it. But there are situations in which machine learning, I think, can be extremely useful. I mean, if you look at Phonodin, it has this very basic data clustering thing for figuring out EGG wave shapes, and that's very, very useful, although it's a very primitive form of machine learning, but it definitely helps. And we're working on a next round of classifiers that will do this, but on other data. And that's going to be very exciting, I think.
Yeah, you also run the VoiceLab meetings of the Voice Foundation, and two questions in one. How do you think the voice labs, around the world are integrated and among one to other, but also how are they integrated with the society? The people in clinics and studios that have ideas about voice, and how do you think the voice labs read this information?
Okay, so I've been thinking quite a lot about that. I mean, and I think we have a situation where we have thousands of people in clinics who are kind of interested in what the voice science has to say, but they are very busy just trying to cope with their patient load and working through a sufficient number of visits a day, and they don't have much say in who gets the money and who gets the training and so on. And whereas the voice scientists, I think on the whole, they are kind of 10 or 15 years ahead of what's going on in the clinics. And I think that's not a good situation. I think we need to beef up the technological platform on the grassroots level. I mean, there's not even a standardized recording procedure that everybody agrees on. It depends on which system you bought. And I would love to see, having done the Soundswell thing in Sweden, it's high time for a new generation of clinical software where we're not at all talking about very advanced analysis. We're just talking about basic recording and listening, really, but in a way that is standardized and that can work together with the hospital databases, so that if I record my voice in one part of Europe and then go to another doctor, they can still get at my voice, as it was before, or that researchers can tap into the clinical recordings and do some big data research, which still is not really possible to do because of all the integrity problems. But again, things are moving there now, and it's just that it's such a huge job. But if we had a standard way of recording, if we had a standard set of analysis tools, then companies would be interested, because then they could make money out of that. And then you would see much more work being done, and you would see more voice labs popping up. So it's a sort of, I don't know if it's a chicken and egg situation, but I think we really have to show that if we measure things like this, then it's really useful. It really shows that the treatment has worked, or that the training has worked, and only when we can show that, is there going to be sort of a financial interest in producing products for that? And we need those products, because otherwise we will never be able to do the big data stuff that we need to do. So this is all sounding a bit, I don't know. We need to somehow encourage people to realize how fascinating the voice is and how important it is in our lives. But we also need to persuade the people with the money that this is worth it. You know, we need that money to make things better.
Yeah. So, and also we still don't have fine equipment for measurements, and so also because of that, because we have only a few companies making these machines, manufacturing these.
Right, and they're doing what they can, but the thing is that the input they are getting from the practitioners is a bit meager. The people in the clinics and in the studios are not quite sure what to ask for, I think, is part of the problem.
Mm.
And so you will have people in universities doing projects trying to figure out what is going to really reveal how the voice works. If we do that, then the companies will jump on, I'm sure. If we can say that this really is meaningful. And that's what interests me, really. I mean, to get to the point where I can say, okay, if you measure the voice in this way and then treat the person, and then we measure it again, and we can really see a meaningful difference that it is reproducible and understandable, knowledge-based, then we will have achieved something important, I think.
And now some more less technological.
Yeah, sure.
For those who are starting voice labs,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they want, they are.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the ideal team of experts to have working in a voice lab besides an engineer?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we were just sort of cherry picking, but then I'm probably very coloured by the way things have been done during my career. But if we have a wish list, maybe we want 2 or 3 clinicians or voice pedagogues, but they should also have some scientific grounding, and there should be a voice and speech therapist, and maybe a physicist, and a statistician, and a software developer, of course, and maybe also an instrumentation engineer, maybe a phonetician or / linguist, or a...
You're writing
also,
Filipa.
and we want a communicator or / teacher for doing the dissemination, because you need to tell people what you're doing, otherwise to provide the rationale for your existence, really. You have, and then, of course, if you can have a good director or administrator, that really is great. And the thing
Right
is,
now, I think the director does everything a bit of everything.
yes, of course, right. And in fact, this is sort of the academic ideal, that you want 3 or 4 people rolled into one, sort of a super performer, and that's almost what's required in the environment today. And
Well,
so, and you are one of them, Filipa. But
well, no, I was going to think we are getting there, our lab, because we have a gynecologist,
yeah,
a statistician,
Yeah.
collaboration with engineers,
there you go.
voice educators, linguistics and phoneticians,
Mhm.
Psychiatrists.
There you go.
No, sorry, psychologists. Sorry, and a psychologist. And so we are missing an ENT. So hang on, because we will find the right one, the perfect one. And you know what? We are based in a voice education faculty. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
I think education is what brings all these different fields together. So
No, I think you're in good shape. It's a challenge for people who want to sort of start because you're not going to get all that money that you need to put all those people together all at once. It's like anything you want to do with other people, that you need to find the people you like and the people who are talented and so on, and then try to keep something going for a number of years till you find your way of operating.
We keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But maybe you can help us also to find out what questions we should pursue in the future. What are the burning questions in voice science at the moment that we should pursue?
Well, I still think it's that we have to demonstrate that voice science has a role to play. I mean, I'm sure it does. But it is very frustrating that if you measure this or that, and you're never going to get a good assessment saying this person is now healthy or this person is now not healthy in the voice. Or if we go to the pedagogical side, this person has achieved the learning objectives or not. What you have to do is you have to make a more integrated assessment. And of course, I know people who are doing this, they're not just staring at the jitter percentage or something like that. That would be very silly. But we need somehow to arrive at more agreement on how to interpret all these metrics and how to use them, and which we should be measuring and which we should not be measuring, because we want to measure as few as we need to,
And maybe we could also try and answer other questions rather than voice health and education, like studies, cross-cultural studies, and bring other things, because the voice is so interdisciplinary that maybe it will allow us to go and pursue support and money from grant holders if we bring up this interdisciplinarity into it. I mean, the community of Madrid has supported our project because we are studying women, and from a also gender perspective, and how they communicate through a period of their lives that is quite challenging, because there are so big hormonal changes. So maybe bring up other perspectives into voice communication rather than just for healthy purposes, I think will be a good idea. Going back to your comment on how difficult it is to find support to develop this type of softwares. Of course, health is very important and should be part of the voice should be part of that umbrella as well. But maybe it's also good to dig into other umbrellas where the voice is also a big part of. So what do you think, Mauro?
Yes. Well,
how would you get money support to do studies on rock, for example?
Yes, I have to find some maybe some rich rock singer.
Well, I mean, that's certainly one way of doing it. I mean, there is quite to do good research, you have to have somebody interested.
Yes.
And if you get somebody with money who's interested, that's great. And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Actually, once I read that Steven Tyler, the singer from Aerosmith, he was funding and study on some kind of artificial vocal fold because maybe he needs.
Yeah, well, there you go. There's a lot of work in tissue engineering, like which could be very interesting.
He was not the only one. It was him and some other singer I don't remember, and an actress. So there are some rich people in need of voice science over there.
No, but again, I've asked around, in Sweden, how much is a clinic willing to pay per patient, and nobody knows. This is the awful truth. So of course, if you don't know how much money you can make on it, you'll never have a company that wants to engage in that sort of environment. So there's so many non-scientific problems like that need to be solved as well. I'm doing this because I think still this is something that is for the general good. I think I hope I can contribute to making voice care better. If I had my free time, I would probably rather build singing machines or something, because that's more fun. I had the privilege of doing that in the 90s. And we're starting now. I have a student who is looking at trying to make to revitalize the source filter synthesis by adding some new things to it, and that's going to be fun, I think.
We look forward for that.
Yeah, because we need also to do things that are interesting and fun, and hopefully they will be to the common good. But if not, at least we are doing something that expands the canvas of the human experience. and so we might seek support in, I don't know, in the arts. That's really one thing that's nice about the arts. You're allowed to do things
off the box.
Out of the box.
Out of the box, yes.
Exactly, right, yeah.
Time for one more question, Mauro, and then we should say Merry Christmas to everybody, and say hang on with us, because we'll be back after vacations with someone spectacular that we'll not tell, so that you will come back and listen to us.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me. Great fun.
No, come on. Without
always have you.
Yes.
So for the last question, we like to talk about singing, teaching of singing being evidence-based, or voice therapy evidence-based, or any other thing evidence-based. What do you think is missing for us to build this some kind of activity based on
yeah. So this is sort of the discussion we tend to have at the VoiceLabs meetings, and it tends to fizzle out. Or rather, I mean, 10 years ago, people were kind of stuck in the issue. Okay, I want to start a VoiceLab. What sort of equipment should I get? Now, in the way I see it, that's the wrong way around. First, you have to ask yourself, all right, what research question do I want to answer, or what clinical need is it I want to address? And it's only when you know that you can start to figure out, okay, what is it I need to measure? And when I know what I need to measure, then I can start thinking about what sort of equipment do I want. Of course, we're never purist like that. We have to have some sort of equipment to get doing something. But I think what we really need is to give up the idea that there is going to be a single number that is going to answer all the questions about the voice, because there isn't. For each condition or each pathology that you can have, we need a separate approach to it, and we need some well-grounded international consensus on how to assess the degree of that pathology and how we are supposed to deal with the pathology. If we don't have sort of standardized approaches, we can never compare one group to another and one treatment to another. And so we need more. How to treat nodules? How do we measure nodules? How do we do what are we going to do with the nodules? That's one thing. And then we go to something else, the edema, or then we go to something else. It's like for other medical disciplines, there are these international consensus groups and standard outcome sets and God knows what. But in the voice field, there isn't very much of that. And it's a boring job, and we must be very grateful for the people who take it on. But unless we can have a common view of what the problem is and how to deal with it, progress is going to be very slow, I think. And
what about in singing education?
Well,
that's what more complicated, isn't it? Because it also deals with aesthetics.
Of course, yeah. Yes. The goals for when training a singer are very far removed, in a way, from the mechanics of singing, which sounds a bit paradoxical. but when you're on the stage, your task is to communicate. You need to get a message across, and to do that, of course, you need very good control of your vocal folds, but that's very far removed from the processes of transmitting an emotion or some sort of message or telling a story. I guess telling a story is the best thing to come across, and I can understand that people in the performing arts are not terribly concerned with formant frequencies and decibels, because it's very far removed from what they are there to do.
Unless you are building the instrument, because the larynx was not made, the primary function is not to produce sounds, but to protect the lungs.
Right.
So you need to build up an instrument from scratch when you start teaching, a young a person who wants to become a professional singer. So to deal with that kind of craft, then you need rather to be very informed about the mechanics of it.
Absolutely.
Otherwise,
Definitely. But I don't know if
you will not have a canvas of colors
no, exactly
from to paint your art.
I agree completely. But the bridge that we need to build is rather long. There are many steps on the way, as I see it, and I think you're doing a fantastic job with that, and I hope I'm doing it in my way, from the other side, if you will. And I think we just have to keep at it and try to improve our understanding of how things all fit together. And the more we can do that, the more I think we can benefit from the science and performers can benefit from each other. So we're not done yet.
No, but hang on, we will continue.
Oh yes,
Yes,
very
yes,
good.
Yes. So as Filipa was saying, this is the last UNED VoiceLab Live of this year. But we will come back, and you can still register yourself to the postgrad course on pedagogy and technology of voice and singing. We're having here in UNED, and it's online. It's in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. And if you want to hear for some more words of Professor Sten Ternström and Filipa Lã, come and see it. I can tell you it's a fantastic course, and I'm not lying.
Thank you, Mauro, and thank you all that stayed with us. Thank you so much, Sten, for agreeing to be with us today. And we will be back after New Year's with more to talk about voice pedagogy, science, technology, voice education, etc., etc. Don't miss us on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Sten.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Mauro.
Thank you, Filipa. Thank you.
Bye-bye.